Good morning, Watershed. My name is Shawn. It is a pleasure to be here with you this morning. This series is, I'm pretty sure, the longest running series in Watershed's history. It's gone by many, many names, but the heart of this series has always been, matters of the heart. Relationships of all kinds. And this year, we're focusing on tools that can help equip us to navigate relationships. Last week, Cedric talked about Marshall Rosenberg's work on nonviolent language as a tool to remaining present in relationship, how to observe and name your needs, how to feel seen, how to be connected with someone. But what if that someone isn't around anymore? The last 3-4 years have just been weird. I feel like they've been weird. I'm going to venture out and say that no one in this auditorium has lived through a pandemic previous to the one COVID-19 gifted us. But beyond learning how to live and thrive through a global pandemic, we've also seen a spike in racial and gender hate crimes. Between both of these, I'm going to call it cultural eras for lack of a better term, we've loved and we've lost. It seems, and this is without exaggeration, that everyone I know has physically lost someone during this pandemic. And in pandemic times, we have been forced to make difficult choices on how to mourn that death. Do we gather? Do you postpone a service? Do you hold one later? Do you just hold one for immediate family? In the midst of the pandemic, we could not lean on traditional ways of honoring death and grieving with loved ones. In the wake of this pandemic, I think that trauma is showing up in profound ways. Communal acts of mourning are important. The absence of them creates holes that are really hard to fill. And then there's a different kind of loss, the relationships we ended because we could no longer mend the broken bridge. We could not feel safe or understand the choices loved ones made. Some of us cut off family members or walked away from decades-long friendships. The Facebook rants bled over to the Thanksgiving meal tables, and that kind of loss requires mourning too. And in both cases, both losses are sustained without closure, without a sense of finality. And that, friends, is one of the most liminal spaces I know. It is an in-between place that is so hard to hold. 1 Corinthians 13:8 tells us that love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. But love endures, even after your person doesn't. My mother was an amazing human being. She was witty and kind and selfless and understanding. To others always, but not always to me. My mother was also mentally ill, and we had a strained relationship. And I love her dearly. And I always felt as though I could never measure up to her expectations. I disappointed her, and I was not a good enough Christian or daughter for her. And I know she loved me. But we had a lot of impasses, a lot of issues that we could not come to compromise on, and it made our relationship difficult. And there were moments of beauty, untouched by her illness, moments when we were both our best selves, moments where we embraced a third way of being, one that didn't require anger or shame or blame, moments of agape love. The love Christ intended, the love of scriptures. And again, visiting the same chapter in 1 Corinthians, it's always the marriage ones, but I'm wanting to reframe this a little bit. We know true love is patient and kind. It doesn't envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes and endures all things. My mother's death was quick. a diagnosis in late July, and a death in early September. And because she lived in Costa Rica and I live here, we couldn't spend much time together. Thankfully, I was able to see her, first to prep her for chemo and to bolster my father for what we thought was going to be a long, hard road. Then 2 short weeks after that visit, I was on a plane again. This time I knew it was to say goodbye to my mother. Okay, so you know those movies? There's like this gut-wrenchingly beautiful but really hard scene, and the parent is asking for forgiveness. Please tell me that you guys, otherwise this is gonna fall flat. Okay, I need some affirmation. I was like, they're not, maybe it's the lights. I can't see you very well, but I freaked out for just a millisecond there. Okay, so we're in the movie, right? And it's like dark lighting, and that parent asks for forgiveness for all the awful things they did, and the adult child realizes their parent was just a victim of the traumas they sustained as a child. Okay, thank you for the nodding. There's low lighting, there's this big declaration, there's lots of tears, this loving goodbye, and there's closure. That did not happen, friends. I helped my mother into the back seat of the car, and we were taking her to the hospital. And I remember I said, "I love you." And she whispered back, "I love you too." And the next time I saw her, she was a catatonic person taking shallow breaths, unconscious, under a veil of morphine and other drugs. God, I am so thankful that our last words were, "I love you." But oh, the things that we left unsaid, which is pretty much how it went my entire adult relationship with her. Our relationship was far from perfect. In fact, while she was alive, I would say it was my single hardest relationship. It often felt like an open wound because I was continually hurt and disappointed by her. And I think she would probably say the same of me. And yet, what I would do to have her still alive in that complicated relationship. And here I am, a year and some change after her death, still reeling, still wondering how a world exists without her in a physical space. So, what closure, I ask? Surviving the loss of a relationship requires resilience. If you've ever lost someone or had to walk away from a deep and meaningful relationship, you've no doubt been in a painful crash course on resilience. Resilience is the essential ingredient that keeps the human spirit forward moving. Rebecca Sofer, I'm not sure, but she's the co-founder of Modern Loss, and she wrote the Modern Loss Handbook. And she says that resilience is the thing that enables you to experience post-traumatic growth, to recognize possibilities, and to find new sources of meaning along the long arc of loss. So here are some of the many iterations of loss we can experience, and this is not an exhaustive list, but you may have experienced a loss of job or career, an illness that you have to carry with you forward, and it changes who you were before, breakups or divorces or uncoupling, physical traumas, emotional traumas, loss of home, loss of safety, loss of a beloved pet, continual disappointments in relationships, death. Today, I want to walk us through some of Sofer's book, The Modern Loss Handbook, to address the loss of someone. And as I was sort of thinking about this and writing it all down, the title that kept coming to me was How to Love a Ghost. And if it wasn't just my mom that I kept conjuring up, but other lost relationships too, the ones where I left things unsaid. Now, I realize that a physical death and a metaphorical death are two different things, or maybe even beasts of completely different colors. But whether the person you loved and lost is dead or still alive, I believe that in both scenarios, the healing can look similar. But also, to be completely difficult and paradoxical, everyone's journey is both singular and different, which is to say that we all grieve differently. Still, I think that there are some basic tools that can help us, each in our own way, move toward healing and possibly even closure. I don't stop being my mother's daughter simply because my mother stopped being. Relationships continue on even if one person has moved into a different space. When someone dies or severs ties, you're still in relationship with them. You will continue to make meaning and nurture or not nurture that relationship as you move through the spectrum of loss. You're connected, and that doesn't change. Reflection becomes a powerful tool for healing. The past holds both beautiful memories that can sustain us and important memories that can teach us. Memories keep people alive in us, and I know that sounds really hallmarky, but I think it's nonetheless true, so just hang there for a second. The key, though, is to use the memories to instruct or to heal or to inform and not to be held back by those memories. So here's what I mean by that. I can hold on to a beautiful memory of my mother and know with certainty that I was deeply loved by her. This memory helps me gain reconciliation, closure, the love that I didn't always see from her, but I know is there, right? So that's a fond memory that I can hold on to. I can also interrogate a not so pleasant memory and study it through a detached lens as best I'm able, asking questions with empathy about why my mother did the thing that she did or reacted a certain way and how that made me feel. And again, that memory, albeit painful, helps me gain reconciliation and closure too. The secret is you have to detach yourself as best you're able to truly reflect on the person you lost. You can make some declarations about the relationship, and you don't have to own these declarations forever. You can reserve the right to change your mind. And likely, as you continue living and growing and evolving, you'll look back and make revisions to those declarations. This intentional work of remembering helps us reconcile with what was, especially if we still yearn for what could have been. The intentional work of remembering helps us own what happened to us. I struggle to name some truths around my mom. So Kim, you're not gonna shout? Kim, I was waiting for them. So Kim and I later are gonna be back on stage and we're gonna be talking about sort of forgiveness and letting go. So we've been prepping and having some conversations. And just hearing how Kim can state facts about her relationship and with her mother so easily, I'm like, oh, I have a lot of work left to do. And that's okay. So what I'm saying here is, if you're in that space where you're like, I don't think I can name the thing yet, it is okay. We are all works in progress, some of us more evolved than others, but it's fine. It's fine. So Kim, in that conversation, she mentioned the work of Byron Katie, speaker, author. She's famed for this method of self-inquiry, and it's simply called The Work. And it begins considering who or what upsets you. So for our conversation today, I want you, if you feel comfortable, to think about the person that maybe you're seeking closure with. And maybe, if you're able, recall a specific memory or a situation with that person. And so there are going to be 4 questions here, right? This is what you need to ask yourself. Is it true? Is it true that my mother is disappointed in me? Can you absolutely know that it is true? How do you react, or what happens when you believe that thought? How do I react when I believe wholly that I'm a disappointment to my mother? And then who would I be without that thought? Interrogating these questions requires honest responses and awareness of the sensations in our bodies, of the feelings that come forward, and any behaviors that might arise. We confront how we treated the other person and how we treated ourselves, trying first to anchor in the memory and name our emotions. The last question allows us to reframe. It gives us an opportunity for a different outcome, and in some cases, frees us to let go and maybe even forgive. The work of naming the hard and the redeeming about my mother can still be done in her physical absence. The connection between us is still there, and our relationship continues even if it operates differently now. With grief as a major catalyst, I continue to evolve, and that shifts how I relate to my mother. I'm 43. Shock and awe, I know. I'm 43, and as my journey in parenthood continues to kind of move down the road, I am making new discoveries about my mom all the time. New moments where I consider what she might have endured at that same age, right? The teenage years are kind of looming ahead of me. The boys are 10, and I get glimpses. I'm nervous. You know the meal trains that they do when newborns happen? I'm gonna sign y'all all up for driving lessons because I have twins, and I just want to check out. I want to go somewhere for 2 weeks and come back and have responsible drivers. I think we can own that. There's a lot of you in this space. It would be like 15 minutes. Can we do it? So scared. I'm so scared, y'all. I'm scared. Anyway, digress. That's for my therapist, probably. Anyway, my orientation to my mother, though, things that I didn't understand as I was a child have come into focus when I reached her age in adulthood. I gained better clarity about her. So here's an example of what I mean. When I was young, I remember my mother was holding my hand in hers, and she turned our palms over, and she was like absentmindedly tracing the lifelines and the creases, and out of nowhere she said, "Soy negra, I'm black." And it caught me off guard. I don't know where her mind had been, but comparing her darker skin tone against my lighter one had triggered something for her. And I remember stumbling to find a way to soothe her, and I instinctively knew to her that association with being darker was not a good thing. Likely, it had something to do with the discrimination she faced as a young Latina immigrant in the United States. Of course, I didn't know that back then. But I knew instinctively that I had to refute that I had to make that statement right for her. So I remember scrambling, fumbling through my Spanish, and I think I said, "No, eres tan," like you're tan. There wasn't a word for tan I still don't know the word for tan. Anyway, I don't remember how old I was, except that we were on a mauve couch instead of a burgundy one. So that places me in elementary school. This is like the 80s and 90s. Those colors, right, were very signature colors in living rooms. Anyway, so flash forward, years forward, right? There's that memory of my mother and I that has come to the surface for me. And I'm a mom now, and one of my sons is sitting next to me on the couch, and our own hands are intertwined. And he's learning about the civil rights movement. He's learning about Martin Luther King, right? Appropriate. And he asked me, "Mom, why is your skin brown?" And y'all, I feel like I got punched in the stomach. My white son, very white, has noticed his mom's brownness. And again, I am scrambling to set it right. And probably with that memory of a young me and my own mother, somewhere in the subconscious of my mind, I begin to explain my brownness. And I'm a storyteller, so I launch into Costa Rica and macaws and tropical rainforests. And you come from the land of, you guys think I'm kidding, it went real performative. Like banana plantations and coffee and the iguanas, and I'm painting this beautiful origin story of my brownness. And he patiently, I think he's in Enneagram 2, he's just patiently listening, and he says, just simply, "I wish my skin was brown too." And in that moment, I realized a few things. I realized I'm not my mom, and that my son has none of the trauma associated with being a brown body in a white world. My son doesn't have my mother's trauma of being a brown body in a white world, or my trauma of being a brown body in a white world. I was putting that on him. But it also brings that memory with my mother when I was a little girl into very sharp focus. And I begin to empathize with her in a way I wasn't able to before. And I can do that, even though she's not here. In this way, we can continue learning about our person. And in doing so, we keep that connection alive. We can also imagine what might have been. What conversations might you have with your person if they were still around as you reach new milestones? What accomplishments would you share? What insights? There is nothing stopping you from writing these down or saying them aloud to your person. And maybe that act is freeing or healing. Maybe that act allows you to embody an experience with them, even if it's imperfect, because after all, every relationship is just that, imperfect. Of course, as we move through grief and tend to our loss, we encounter triggers. Those are landmines, right? We can work towards healing, we can work to forgive and release, and we can even come to peace with the loss of someone or of a relationship. But there will always, I think, be waves of grief that swallow us whole. Unseen triggers. Maybe it's a sense of nostalgia that bubbles up from nowhere, or an intense yearning that cripples, a rage that bubbles up, anger at a wound that refuses to heal. Anniversaries become landmines, death dates, wedding anniversaries, birthdays, holidays. They all become marked in time by like the great before and after, right, in all caps there. Triggers pull us back in time viscerally. We feel it all again, as if for the first time. And I honestly don't know if this changes over time, but I do know that the way that we are feeling in those triggered moments is okay, no matter how many years or seasons pass. One way to navigate big days is to memorialize them. For special dates like anniversaries or birthdays, we can create rituals to help us honor and process loved ones that no longer exist in our physical orbits. Rituals have a structured nature to them, and it is this structure that offers us a sense of control. They help fill the void with something meaningful, and they can create sacred space. Consider biblical traditions and rituals: baptism, communion. These are hallowed rites, known in many church spaces as sacraments, and they provide ceremony and blessing. Soffer says this of rituals. She says, rituals create patterns of thinking, feeling, and doing that ground us in the world that we're in, even if our person is gone. And even if your person is still alive, consider how the performance of ritual allows you to reframe the relationship. Think about how empowering rituals can be in the narrative that we write. We get to choose how to honor that person, that relationship. We get to choose also how to enact practices of self-care that move us towards healing spaces. And again, give yourself permission to evolve those ritual practices over time as needed. Let them be solitary events or invite others to celebrate with you. Choose something that pays it forward or do something in total secrecy. You establish the terms. What rituals can you create to help provide healing and closure? Rituals help establish care for the soul. They help us through a triggering season, but of course, grief is all-encompassing, and it permeates everything. Profound loss leads to intense grief, and your emotional well-being is of paramount importance. And so what I'm saying gently is this: you need to tend to your mental health the way you do your physical one. And there is no shame in grief counseling. Bereavement policies in the United States suck. Oh, did you know that? They're terrible. It's like I don't know. I got off the plane on a Sunday and I was teaching class on a Monday. And that ended up being the right thing. I needed the distraction, but bereavement policies in the United States are a joke. Western culture conditions us to believe that we are meant to get to work as usual, right? Get back to the routine, to move on and bury our pain. And life continues on despite the aching hole. Kids, turns out they still need parenting. Work still needs to be completed. But hear me on this, you have to make time, and you have to reclaim what belongs to you. Take the time you need without apology. That part might be hard for some of us. And do the work. Do the work, or else I promise you a mental health crisis sits around the bend. For me, joining a grief group was a safe space to share my feelings vulnerably without fear of being misunderstood. Sitting in a room of people who were also in the throes of grief, whatever came out of my mouth was likely not going to be judged because I was among people who got it. They understood. My rage was appropriate, and I could share the ugly and not make it awkward. And I make everything awkward almost all the time. The freedom, though, to be unfiltered as I moved through various emotions was a gift. And while I wouldn't say I was wearing a mask 99% of the time, there is this performative aspect that occurs when you navigate grief. There's sort of this like unspoken expiration date when a community is like, she's good, right? We can move on. It's right around the time the meal train stops. Or people stop asking you how it's going. Or when they do, I don't think they really want the real answer, right? I still cry myself to sleep, Larry. Thanks for asking. That's not going to happen at the water cooler. It's just not. So I say, yeah, I'm good. I'm doing, right? I don't know what else I'm supposed to say. Grief has no end date. It morphs over time, but I truly believe we don't stop grieving. This means that no matter where you are in your grief journey, you can always seek professional support. Do not forget that you have agency. Grief can be isolating, and it can be scary and lonely and hard and depressing, but it is also true that grief can open you up to authentic connection with others, connections that reach deeper and are ultimately more satisfying. My friendships with people who see me in my grief and have stayed true and patient with me as I navigate these waters has been a blessing I didn't know existed. My marriage has deepened in ways I never imagined. Some of my relationships are anchored now in a strong bedrock of trust and respect that colors everything else. Negotiating social networks and work is tricky after loss, for sure. And the work of healing requires setting boundaries. And boundaries are incredibly hard for me. And that's a large part due to my mom. In my childhood, I worked really hard to please others because my notions of being good were tied to serving others at a sacrifice of my own needs. I sacrificed boundaries. And so here we have reached the part of the program where you're supposed to do as I say and not as I do. I struggled to set boundaries. So in the counseling books that I'm turning to on this subject, for support, boundary setting is critically important. That's what the book says. I don't know yet. Stay tuned. But grief does often throw things off center. You're forced to confront mortality and the hard truth that there are some things that are just well beyond our control. In the midst of that ambiguity, boundaries help place safety gates around your heart. And here's the thing, you owe no one your grief story. Not significant others, not friends, not family. Be selective with the guardians of your grief. Choose people who will not make demands on your time, your process, or your sharing. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, be gentle and kind to yourself in this journey. Oh, dear ones, we carry our grief with us. It's at work, sitting on the desk next to our coffee, at dinner with our friends, sitting patiently in the booth beside us, at home, taking up space as we do laundry. Life is hard enough. Life in mourning is even harder. There will be days where it all feels pointless and mundane. There will be days when our bodies physically reject the notion of a daily schedule. There will be days when we cannot focus on a damn thing. Take time back. Maybe that's scaling back on your commitments. Maybe it's shutting down social media earlier in your day. Maybe it's taking breaks. But the work of honoring all the complex emotions, of grieving a messy, complex relationship, it is holy work. Go slow. Go earnestly. You tread on hollow ground. The Lord is in this work with you. So many lines of scripture point to this truth. If you just Google scripture for grief, there's a ton. It's the cross-knit ones that you just put on towels and stuff. One of them is that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The God who knit you in the womb, who knows you thoroughly, sees you in the midst of your grief. I think about Jesus going to Bethany to see his beloved friend Lazarus. The gospel tells us that Jesus distinctly knew that Lazarus' illness would not lead to death, but rather to glory for God. A reading from the story of John would show us two sides of Jesus here then. The all-knowing, powerful deity that would use Lazarus' death to glorify God and foreshadow his own encounter with death and ultimate resurrection. But then there's also the human Jesus who is moved to tears. It says in one line of scripture, he wept. Even though he knew the rest of the story, even though he knew this death wasn't permanent, Jesus wept. He felt sorrow. He felt grief. And this tells me that grief is holy. This tells me not to fear grief, not to push it away, but to embrace it. And of course, death is not the end. Jesus' resurrection story teaches us that. That's a talk for a different Sunday. I would like to close us out tonight, in prayer, a prayer of affirmation. Safra ends her books with tenets, these truths she says that cannot be taken away. She calls it a grief manifesto, which I love. I've included some of those tenets in this prayer, but I thought maybe we should just start with a cleansing breath. So take a minute to come back to your body, situate yourself in a way that maybe feels comfortable for you. Maybe it's putting, both feet solidly on the ground. Just bring awareness to your body, to any sensations you might feel. Feel the flow of air entering and leaving your body. Scan for any tightness or pain. Acknowledge what you're feeling. Breathe deeply. God, you are perfect love. You are agape. God, you guide us to healing, to closure, to trust. In the safe harbor of your love, may we come to know that we have the right to create personal space around our grief, that we have the right to maintain boundaries around our grief, that we have the right to take the time we need in our grief. We have the right to prioritize our healing in this journey of grief. God, help us remember that we don't have to manage anyone's emotions but our own. Help us name the truths, however hard they may be, so that we can step into the light of healing. Help us seek the help we need and release us from any shame or any guilt. Help us know that death is not the end. And let us be thankful for the small mercies that show up in the work of grief. Let us be thankful for the ways in which we are made new by grief. Amen.